Hello everybody, and welcome to my second of two videos on this, the Canon A-1. In the first video we looked at what everything was and talked about some of the minor things that don't need tons of discussion. In this video we're going to talk about the rest of it and talk about how to do everything you can possibly do with this camera as it is right now. But the first thing that we've got to do, because this camera can't do anything at all without a battery, is see how to change the battery. If you don't have, you should try to see if you can find one of your hot shoe covers like this. This also works as your camera battery door key. You'll need to take your action grip off of the camera, and then there's a little dude on the front right here. The other thing you can do if you don't have one of these is get just a generic one of these off eBay and kind of file this down to shape. But you just put this into the latch there, and now you can open your battery door. Opening these battery doors incorrectly is a major reason that they break, especially if you just try to use your fingertip, because when you use your fingertip, it's easy for these to twist, which can cause them to shatter up here or to get too much pressure on them and crack down here. You might also find, as I'm going to do right now, that if you're going to change the battery, you have to take your lens off to get the door open enough. Now, a note on batteries: I generally recommend Duracell or Energizer or another established brand, and not one of the fly-by-night brands that's on everybody's favorite online mega retailer, because the nice brands tend to be better and don't explode so much. That said, in fairness, PX28 exploding is not a huge issue unless a battery's been left in the camera for a very, very long time. But to remove the battery, you just simply pry it out and then remove it here. You can see inside that's what a clean battery chamber should look like. The negative terminal goes down, positive up, and the dude right here on the bottom, that little contact, is spring powered to help hold the battery in place, and that should depress into the camera's body very easily and spring right back up. When the PX28 batteries explode in the Canon A series, one of the things that happens is that corrosion gets into the spring mechanism, and then those get jammed, which can make it impossible to reload a new battery, or worse, can make it so that the battery doesn't fit tightly enough and it can't make a contact. If the latter has happened, you can put a little bit of tinfoil at the top or the bottom to make that connection, just the tiniest amount though. Oops, that wasn't supposed to go in just yet. All right, so being out of name brand batteries, I'm going to use this one that came with something just the other day. I have no idea, remote or something like that. Anyway, we're just going to drop it in negative contact first, push down, slide it in like that, and we're now going to close the battery door. Hot shoe cover back in place. Action grip. We're going to cover up that battery door to help protect it, and the action grip will help make this camera more enjoyable to hold. Tighten it down, and we've changed the battery. Don't forget that after you put a new battery in, you want to check the battery, and you push the button down here, and if that light blinks, you have a good battery. Now that we've changed the battery, let's talk about how to mount and remove lenses. We're going to cover all three types: FDN, FD, and FL. We're going to play a little bit of make-believe with FL so I can show you how to use those. This is an FDN lens. It has a silver lens release button down here, a black ring at the back that doesn't turn when you mount it. So to mount these lenses, you want to find the red dot and the red dot. Make sure that they're aligned. They need to be. And also, I had been told by, I think it was the guy who sold me this camera, that with the A1 and the rest of the automatic A series cameras, you want to take the FDN lenses and set them to a specific aperture and mount them on the camera that way, or else you risk damaging the camera. Weird thing is, nothing on the back of the lens changes when I do that adjustment. And I asked my buddy Joe Coretta, who has repaired Canon A bodies since they were invented, about that, and he said he had not heard that. So I don't honestly know what the truth is, but I've also not really been good about not mounting these without it being an A. So at any rate, red dot to red dot, We're just going to put it on and twist until it clicks, and when the FDN clicks in place, we know it's loaded. To remove the FDN, we find the silver button and push it down, turn it counter or anti-clockwise until the red dots align, and then pull it off of the camera. To mount an FD lens, we're going to grab this one and we're going to turn the lens mounting ring to release the body or the rear cap. So basically you can see the red dots here. You need to turn the red dot until it lines up with the focusing index, just like that. Next we're going to take the FD lens. There's no corresponding red dot on the underside. Red dot to red dot again, and we're going to turn the silver ring clockwise until we can't turn it anymore. There's no clicking into place with the FD lenses. If you have an FD lens with the A on it, that works just like automatic mode for the FDN lenses. If you have one that has a green circle on it, that works just like the A mode on the FDN lenses. So this lens will allow me on this camera to use the automatic and semi-automatic modes. All right, so what if, and then to remove an FD lens, all you have to do is rotate the silver ring until the red dots line up and then remove it. But what if I had an FL lens? Well, let's pretend this is an FL lens and I'll show you how to use it. You mount the FL lens exactly like you do an FD lens. The aperture ring on the FL lens will be at the front. You're going to use what's called stop-down metering. You can do this ideally in manual mode. This is not really well suited for program mode because when you're using program, aperture priority, or shutter priority with stop-down metering, you have to have the aperture engaged. It's not an idea that it's not something that's good for the camera mechanism, and this is across cameras all across the board. To take a photo while you have a lens stop down, because when you stop down the lens, you're forcing the aperture mechanism here to engage, and when you take a picture, the camera is expecting to engage that as part of the cycle. So with FL lenses, manual metering will work better. And to do that, what you're going to do is push this clip up right here on the DOF preview button and then push it in. And when you do that, you might be able to see that the aperture inside of here has stopped down. So you know what your aperture is going to be. We're at f8 right now on this lens. You take your meter reading and then you adjust your shutter button, your shutter speed rather, until you get to the correct speed to give you a proper meter reading. And then you take your photo. Oh, I just did that with the DOF preview locked in place. I guess that's okay on this camera, because that sounded just fine. There we go. But with the FL lenses, ideally, turn off your DOF preview, obtain your focus, because it is easier to focus wide open, and then take your photo. So, all right, there we go. Just debunked my own myth. Anyway, so that's how you do stop-down metering. If you're going to stop-down meter with an FL lens, the darker the aperture gets, the less accurate the meter is going to be. Meters will be accurate to f5.6 for sure, maybe f8. f8 should be accurate with the A1, but if you're smaller than that, f11, 16, 22, what you'll want to do is meter at f8 and then compensate with additional light in your shutter speed and just go with that, because your meter reading can be thrown off by the reduced light coming through the lens when it's stopped way down. Next thing that we're going to do is load film into the camera. So we know how to change the lens, we know how to put the battery in, we can start taking photos now. To open the film back, we just lift up on the film back release, grab our roll of 35mm, drop it in, push the film release knob and lever back into place, pull out a leader like this, make sure we've taken a photo and that we are in a specific shutter speed, because you don't want to have your lens cap on or have this be a very long shutter speed because you're in an automatic mode. Pull out your leader and pull it over so that it can feed into one of the slits in the take-up spool. Just going to put my fingers over the sprockets and sprocket holes right here. There we go. That looks like that's going to be pretty good. I'm comfortable with that. Once we've got our film loaded, we close the film back. And now we're going to advance until we get to, where's the frame count window? I forgot to talk about that in the first video. Frame count window's right there, and out of sight, out of mind. We're just going to advance until we get to frame 1. And if you look at the film rewind knob here, I'll take the slack out so it's a little bit more obvious. When I advance the film rewind knob turns. And that's because the film is connected from the take-up spool to the rewind knob. That's why when we're done with the film, we can use this to rewind the film. So we're at frame 1. We can just start going about our day, taking photos. Everything's advancing smoothly and easily, and we can take photos until we run out of film. At that point, we rewind the film. Film, if you've not used it, is one and done. It can be used a single time to record an image with an correct aperture and shutter speed for the lighting conditions that you have. And when you have that, it will record photons in a manner that give you an image. Or you can expose it to light and have it record all the photons that reach it until it's completely unable to record anymore by opening your back like this. If you open the back of your camera while you have film loaded in it, all of the film that is outside of the cassette will be erased. Any photos you have taken, any photos you could take, will be gone. So I'm doing this to show you how film moves inside of the camera as you take photos. You push your shutter button and your film advances. And the amount that it advances is 2 millimeters longer than your shutter area. And this is the process of film moving through the camera as you take photos. Now you're done with your film, it's time to rewind it. We're going to push the button, the film rewind button on the bottom. You don't have to hold it in place. And then we're just going to start rewinding the film. I'll use my finger here to hold the cassette because the back is open, but I want you to see how the film moves through the camera and then how it moves back into the cassette as we rewind it. Just like that. Now, at this point, film is rewound into the cassette. It is now safe to open up the back of the camera. We're going to lift up the film knob, take out our cassette. When you are done with a cassette, it's a good idea to rewind the film all the way into it so you don't accidentally use that cassette again and take double exposures on the whole thing. Then you can put in your next roll of film, or if you're done shooting for the day, close the back of the camera. Make sure to trip your shutter and take out your battery if you have one of the cameras that drains the battery overnight. And don't forget, after you've loaded film, to adjust your ASA setting to match your ISO setting, and then you're good to go. Let's talk a little bit about flash use with the Canon A-1. Here's your camera's hot shoe. We can plug a flash right into there. And here's your camera's PC port. We can plug a flash right into there as well. So the PC port we'll cover first because it's really quick. This is a PC cable. It stands for Pronter Compor, not personal computer. And those two lens shutter makers many decades ago created this standard plug so that flashes could be standardized instead of every maker having a different flash connection, which was the case. So the PC cable just goes right into the PC port like that, and that's how you connect that cable. These cables can then be used to connect to radio triggers today just fine. You can also use it to connect to flashes that have plugs for the PC cables. And having a cable allows you to have your flash off your camera. So we'll talk about that in a second and why that's important. The other place you can plug a flash into your camera is right here in the hot shoe on top of the camera, and then you have your flash here right above your lens. The worst place to have a flash on your camera is right here above your lens. And the reason is that when you take a picture, the light leaves the flash, reaches your subjects, bounces off your subjects, and goes back to your lens. And that, if you're using color film, will give your subjects red eye, and it will also make them very flat and waxy looking because the light is reaching them in a flat wave and then bouncing back in a flat wave. It's not a flattering look for anyone because it's not how we see people. So if you think about the way that we see the world outside, underneath the sun, or if we're out at night underneath street lights, or indoors when the lights in the hallway are above us, our brains are used to seeing things lit from above. We think of things that are lit from above as looking natural, and so you want to replicate that look with your flash in as much as possible. That's why this is a bad idea, unless you have a flash that can do this and bounce the light off of the ceiling. This will allow you to aim the light at the ceiling so that it leaves your flash, reaches the ceiling, back to your subject, and then back to your lens, and then the light that you have used or created with your flash replicates overhead lighting. Okay, the other, even better than that, is if you have a flash that has an articulating head and a tilting head and a swiveling head or body as well, because then if you don't have a ceiling, you can bounce it off of the wall, or if you have both, you can bounce it off the ceiling and the wall and just create even better, more even lighting. There are some other things you can do as well. So let's say you have a flash that only points directly forward. If you get your hands on something called a flash bar, which looks like this, it's basically a piece of metal with a tripod screw for your camera, and this connects to a tripod if you have it, and then another screw over here that you can connect an adapter to your flash for. You can now use your camera next to your flash, and if you are shooting in portrait orientation, you can bounce your light off of the ceiling, or in landscape, off of the wall. This gives you the ability to move your flash way off to the side or up above your camera, and then articulate it in a direction so that you have more control over how your lighting looks when it reaches your subject. So with this camera, the flash sync speed for X flashes, and this is what we're going to cover because they're the most common type, is 1/60th of a second. So why is that? When your shutter curtain opens, it'll open like this, and then the second curtain will follow, and while the two curtains are open, that's when the picture is taken, and then when you advance the film, they reset like that, okay? So at 1/60th of a second, the first curtain opens, the entire film is exposed to light for about a 60th of a second, and then the second curtain closes, repeat, right? All right, so what about 1/2 second? First curtain opens, the entire film is exposed to light for about a 1/2 second, close, and repeat, just like that. Okay, but what about 1/1000th of a second? First curtain opens, second curtain follows right behind, and at no time is the entire film exposed to light with a shutter speed faster than 1/60th of a second. What happens is the first curtain opens and the second curtain follows closely behind it, and the size of that gap determines whether it's 1/125th or 1/1000th. So if you trigger your flash while you're using a shutter speed faster than 1/60th of a second, you're going to get a little strip of illuminated light off to the side of your image, and then the rest will be dark. Next thing we're going to talk about is how to interpret the viewfinder information on the Canon A-1. So here's a printout I made of the viewfinder. I rebuilt what the viewfinder looks like. That's why the fonts are not correct down here in Affinity Design, and printed this. We only have a black and white printer, but the shutter speed, aperture, and the M over here should be red. That's the color that they'll be in your viewfinder. So by default, this is a split prism viewfinder. It could have been swapped by Canon, but you probably have a split prism. I've never seen an A1 without the split prism before. There were 7 additional options available for viewfinders, however, if somebody had sent their A1 in to get it swapped out. So the meter and gauge down here is going to tell you different information. In program mode, and we're going to talk about how to get into the different modes in just a moment. In program mode, it will tell you what shutter speed and aperture it's going to use. Okay. In shutter priority, where you pick the shutter speed, it's going to tell you what aperture it's going to use. In aperture priority mode, where you pick the aperture and then the camera picks the shutter speed, it's going to tell you what shutter speed it'll use. And in full manual mode, which you'll get when that M is on, by the way, that M will be off in the other modes, the camera will tell you what your settings should be. And then you just have to either set them or adjust them. F8 and 1/125th is the same. F16 and 1/30th, I think, is that? Am I do my math enough the right way? Would be the same. If you add more light by a stop or reduce light by a stop with your aperture, you have to go in the opposite direction with your shutter speed and vice versa to maintain the same exposure. So even in even with this camera, manual mode is still kind of shutter priority-ish. If you adjust your aperture in full manual mode, your camera is going to give you the same information. So let's say you're set at 1/250th of a second, and you need an f/5.6 aperture for this shutter speed with your lighting, and you're set at f8, you'll need to set it to f/5.6. Okay, but I really want to use f8. If I set the aperture to f8, the meter's still going to say this. So what you need to do is, I'm at f8, I need to adjust the shutter speed until this number changes and this says f8. So changing the aperture in manual mode will not change the shutter speed that you need to use. Changing the shutter speed in manual mode will tell you which aperture you need to use that's different than what you have. So full manual mode on the A1 is sort of like shutter priority, do it yourself. So some information about how this actually works, what you can actually do with this, is your metering is center weighted, if you recall. That means an area about like this in the middle of the prism, or the viewfinder rather, is where most of your metering occurs, and then outside of that is where the minority of your metering is going to occur. So you can use this to your advantage. If you're in manual mode, or we'll get to the automatic modes in just a second. Let's say you want to take a picture of a person, and you want their head up here and their shoulders to be down here. They've got their arms, and right, okay. So that's your person. You're going to take a portrait orientation image. Put their face in your metering area, dial in your settings in manual mode, recompose to get the full shot, take your photo. In aperture or shutter priority or program mode, meter off their face in the same way. Hold down the exposure memory button, recompose, and take your photo. And that way you can use your center weighted meter to get a proper meter reading off of your human subject's face. Dog subject, cat, whatever, horse. If you're taking a photo of something that has a face, that's a good technique to use. You can also use this approach. Let's say you're sitting underneath an awning, okay? There's a big beach out here and an ocean, and then you guys are sitting here in shade. You don't have to meter off anything in the scene. You can take your camera, point it at the concrete patio, take a meter reading off that concrete patio, recompose in the exact same way as we just talked about in the portrait example, and using the same buttons and same approach with settings, and then take your photo, and you have now used the meter here to meter off of the light that's where you are at to get a proper exposure for your subject who's sitting across from you underneath the patio. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is how to access each of the modes in the camera. So it comes with 4 modes: program, aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual, and that's the order we're going to talk about them in. To get into program mode, you set your mode control dial here to TV, shutter priority, and you set the setting to P, put up the guard here so that you don't accidentally take it out of there, and set the aperture to A for automatic aperture control. You have program shutter control, automatic aperture control. The camera will now do all of the work for you about how to control the different settings, okay? And that's how you get into program mode. To get into shutter priority mode, you have this setting here, and you simply select a specific shutter speed. Automatic aperture control, manually specified shutter speed. So you'll pick a shutter speed here, and the camera will pick the best aperture for the shutter speed in your film and your light. If your information in your viewfinder blinks, then what's going to happen is that it's telling you your aperture cannot give you a proper exposure. You either don't have a small enough aperture if there's tons of light, or you don't have a large enough aperture if there's not much light, and you will have to adjust your shutter speed to get those lights to stop blinking inside your viewfinder. We're going to leave the lens in A, and we're going to rotate this switch to AV, aperture value, aperture priority is what's called in the industry, and now what you're going to do is pick the aperture on this wheel. I have an f2.8 lens in here, so I can't pick f1.4. If I do, the aperture value is going to blink inside the display telling me, hey guy, this lens can't do that. So I'm going to go back to f2.8. All you have to do is pick the aperture you want to use on this dial, and then the camera will pick the best shutter speed. Blinking information means that you have you have settings that are not compatible with your lighting, your shutters, your available shutter speed range, or the apertures available on your lens. Full manual mode goes back to shutter speed control here, and we take the lens aperture ring off A. And now we have full manual mode. And basically what we're going to do is, as I explained a couple of minutes ago, you'll look inside your viewfinder. It will tell you your shutter speed and aperture that you want, or more accurately, whatever shutter speed you have selected, the aperture that you need for a proper exposure given your light and film selection in that instance. All right, so now that we've gone over everything with this camera, let's talk about how to actually take a picture with it. First thing you're going to do is figure out what setting you want, PAS or M, which mode. Once you know which mode you want, you're going to get all of your things set up exactly as you want them to be. You're going to dial in your settings to get the exposure that you want. You're going to focus your lens. You're going to look through the viewfinder back here. Focus your lens until you get what you want to have in focus, in focus. And then you just take a picture. And that's the process of taking a picture. If you want to do something different for your next one, change focus, change settings. It's pretty simple once you get everything dialed in just to take the photo that you want. Okay, pictures are pretty simple. Do you think we could take double exposures with this camera? We sure could. I'm going to show you how to do that. The A1 makes double exposures very easy. So first thing that we want to do is take any slack out of the film before our double exposure. This will just help ensure that we get the best results we can. So just rewind the film rewind lever until we get resistance. Don't crank it after you get resistance, just gently until it stops, and now you're set. The mechanics of taking a double exposure are, well, once you're ready, you take your first frame, you push the double exposure lever, which is right there, in towards the center of the camera, and then you advance the film, and now you take your second exposure, and then you advance the film. And because of this mechanism here, you don't have to take a dead frame, which if you've seen almost all of my other camera manuals, I talk about taking a dead frame afterwards. This means you don't have to do that. Okay, great. That's the mechanics of it. Let's talk about the science of exposure. So when you have film is engineered for a proper exposure to be a certain number of photons, okay, that reach the film and create the image. So when you have, let's say, 1/125th of a second at f/5.6 is a proper exposure. You take that exposure, you advance the film, and now you take a second one. If you do a double exposure, 1/125th at f/5.6, 1/125th at f/5.6, the film has received twice as much light as it's designed to receive. And what's going to happen is your negative is going to end up being what's called thick, dark, or dense. Those are three words that mean the same thing. The film received too much light. If you scan or digitize your film, you're going to have low contrast and high digital noise. If you print in the darkroom, you're going to have low contrast and very long print times, or much longer print times. And that's because the film has gotten too much light. Okay? When you get your negatives back, an overexposed image will look very dark on your negative strip. So that's what that would look like. So we have to put, if we're going to do a double exposure, each exposure needs to be half as much light as we would like it to be. We're going to go through how to do this in each of the modes. So we're going to start with manual because it's really easy to illustrate that process. So let's say we're at 1/125th of a second and f/5.6. Okay. Take our first photo. Oh, but that's exactly what I told you not to do, isn't it? Yeah, it sure is. I goofed. All right, so let's say we're in full manual mode right here. 1/125th of a second and f/5.6 is a proper exposure. In order to get a double exposure that is the same amount of exposure as the rest of the negatives, then we're going to need to cut the amount of light in half. There are two ways to do that. We can adjust the aperture, f8 is 1 stop slower, which is half as much light as f5.6. And that will allow us to take 2 double exposures with less light. Or if you are certain you want f5.6, then you can control the shutter speed. 1/250th is half as much light as 1/125th because these are fractions, and that is half as much time. Half as much time, half as much light. Okay. So those are the 2 ways in manual mode that you can control that. But let's say that you are in any of the automatic modes. The camera is going to automatically pick a proper exposure with your shutter speed or aperture or both, depending on which mode you're in. So you're going to have to trick the camera, and that's really easy to do. We're going to push the exposure value compensation button, switch this to 1/2. 1/2 of the light is going to be perfect for a double exposure for 2 frames in a row. So if you use the EV compensation dial to 1/2, then what you're doing is telling the camera, give me half as much light as I actually should have for this next frame. So that allows you to get a properly exposed double exposure. In theory, you could even go to a triple exposure. Or if you wanted to go really crazy and you want to do 14 exposures on your frame, then you need 15 exposures, I think -7 stops. And you could then go 2 stops here and then 5 stops on your ISO ring, and you could get to -7, which will give you enough for about 14, 15 exposures on the same frame. You can go crazy. This camera is really versatile in that regard and allows you a lot of flexibility for doing things that no one has ever advised anyone to do like that. So at any rate, that's just the mechanics and the science behind the double exposure. And when you're done, just keep shooting. Thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next camera manual.